would US's Russia policy look like under Trump or Kamala?
It's almost certain that Kamala Harris, if she wins, right, has no foreign policy experience or knowledge whatsoever. Some other version of Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan will be running the country. If Donald Trump wins, no one knows what he's going to do. And like I said, Donald Trump doesn't know what he's going to do. Depends on who Donald Trump talked to 15 minutes ago and flattered him and convinced him of something. He's not a man who has foreign policy principles.
So I want to come to the recent events in Germany where the government has announced that it can no longer fund, especially the German government can fund the Ukrainian military. So do you think this scenario will replicate across Europe? And can the Europeans really fund the Ukrainian war without the US financial support?
Okay, so first of all, there needs to be an admission that one of the primary reason Germany is in the economic and the budget situations they are in is blowback from their failed economic war of sanctions against Russia. They were an industrial export-driven economy whose economy was competitive primarily because of the cheap, reliable supply of energy, principally natural gas, but oil, coal, everything else as well from Russia. They cut themselves off from it, or take your pick. At some level, it's almost certain that the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, and the U.S. with the German government's obvious acquiescence, cut them off from it. And the Western media has been full of stories describing what is happening in Germany as a result. And the word that comes up again and again in the German press and the Western press is deindustrialization, right? That is what is happening. Germany's biggest companies are considering right now, that many of them are in the process of moving to the United States, where at least the energy costs are relatively less. And that is leading to the economic and the budgetary crisis in Germany. They don't want to admit that linkage, but it's undeniable, really. So yeah, they're having problems. There's a huge hole in the German budget that they really can't fill. At the same time, they just announced a new arm package for Ukraine that will include something like 77 refurbished Leopard 1A5 tanks, right? And hundreds of armored fighting vehicles, right? So while they're saying right now that they can't continue the financial aid. Well, that could also be a bit of domestic politics as well. We'll have to see where that comes out in the future. Certainly, they're not completely giving up, but ultimately, what happens in Europe will take very strong cues from what happens in the United States. Europe is not going to waste all of their money if Donald Trump comes to power in the United States, and no one knows what Trump will do. Trump doesn't know what Trump will do, right? But let's say that he cuts off all financial and military aid to Ukraine. Let's for the sake of argument. I don't necessarily believe that. I actually don't believe that the US president has the power to dictate over the blob, the deep state, the permanent bureaucracy of the hegemon. I don't believe the US president has that power. And I think Trump found that out during his first term. But let's assume that he does. That's what he set on, and he cuts it off for the sake of argument. Is Europe going to then keep pumping? Are they going to make up the difference of what? No, they can't. Right. And are they going to throw good money after bad? No, certainly not all of them. Maybe some of them will. Some countries, some of them will be willing to beggar their own countries in the pursuit of weakening Russia, right? I'm looking at the Baltics, right? I mean, but not only them, right? Not that, that will really make a difference, but so much depends on what happens in the United States politically with the future of this conflict. So it's very hard to predict what Europe will do until we know what is going to happen in the United States and have some sense of what Trump can and will do as a result of that. Certainly, his selection of J.D. Vance, whom he's a military veteran himself, as his running mate, as his potential vice president. He's a military veteran. On one hand, has pretty principally been against support for the Kiev regime. He thinks it is a strategic mistake. He's one of those Republican of a more realist bent that dreamed of splitting Russia and China and then going after China, because while he doesn't want war with Russia, he desperately wants war with China and Iran. And that seems to be really, as far as I'm concerned, there is only three types of political elite in Washington, D.C. They all want war with Russia, China, and Iran in the pursuit of U.S. global hegemony and primacy. But they prioritize which conflict they think is more important and should be thought now. Right now, the or at least for the last few years, the anti-Russia hawks have been driving Washington. There is continuing rumors of a resurgence of the anti-China faction saying, oh, we need to drop this Ukraine thing and move to what's really important, creating a Thucydides trap war with China off of China's coast by provoking them over Taiwan. But we also see this continual forgive the vulgarity, clusterfuck that's going on in the Middle East with Netanyahu trying to provoke, to escalate his way out of a war with a Hamas by provoking a larger regional conflict between the U.S. and Iran. I mean, that has been his clear and obvious goal since last November, right? I mean, that's pretty clear. So the U.S., I think, is really starting to come to grips with how limited what it can achieve geopolitically in the world with the military and economic resources it has right now, principally the military resources. It can't even provide enough artillery shells and air interceptor missiles for the Kiev regime in Ukraine, much less also provide artillery shells and air defense missiles for a wider Israeli war against Hezbollah and Iran, which is why they've been so accommodating to avoid a larger conflict with Iran. And it has to be said that Iran doesn't want that conflict either, right? It doesn't mean they love each other. It doesn't mean they don't want war with each other at some point in the future. But neither one of them wants that war now. The only one who does is Netanyahu. But unfortunately, for the incredible vagaries of U.S. politics and the influence that the American-Israeli Political Action Committee, AIPAC, has over U.S. politics, particularly in an election year, Netanyahu is in the driver's seat. He's the brat prince who can do whatever he wants, more or less. And I really recommend, you mentioned Stephen Walt before. Stephen Walt and Mearsheimer wrote a book together about AIPAC's pernicious influence on U.S. foreign policy and how distorting an effect that was, which is a principled critique of the U.S.-Israeli foreign policy relationship. But of course, the government of Israel immediately responded with the anti-Semitism card, right? And tried to paint John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt as anti-Semites, which is ludicrous and sad. it's really sad that that can be done. I mean, the same thing was done to Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, which was another crime. But it is what it is. So that there's still so many ways that this conflict in Ukraine could spin off. And there are a lot of people that think that what we're seeing, not just in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East and ever growing in China, is really a series of conflicts that at some point will be recognized in the future as the early stages of World War III, a war of countries in the rest against US led Western global hegemony for the future world order. And there's some evidence that that is true because we have heard multiple times from not just US leaders, but other Western leaders as well, that they regard the conflict in Ukraine alone as a world order shaping conflict. They believe that their hegemony, US hegemony, is on the line in Ukraine. That if NATO is seen, perceived by the rest of the world, to whatever extent as losing to Russia, a country they had derided as Nigeria with snow for years, that will create some type of new dominoes theory effect, right? Where China will recover Taiwan, and I don't know, Venezuela will take over South America, and cats and dogs will live together on the streets, and it will be the end of the world. I mean, that's the way they think of it, but they truly believe this. They say U.S. leadership is on the line. They say that the rules-based international order, whatever the fuck that is, we make the rules, we give the orders, is on the line. But Boris Johnson said it flat out, right? Which is one of the things I love Bojo for. He said U.S. hegemony is on the line, and that's what it is, and that's why I believe that at the end, we're nowhere near the end game of this conflict in Ukraine and its potential of spinning off into other conflicts. That the West is not going to back down, that they're going to have to intervene directly at some point. And there's so much potential for this to spin out into Belarus, into Moldova. We've seen Russians and Ukrainians fighting in Mali, right? We've seen Netanyahu claim that drone strikes on Iran were in support of Ukraine because they were destroying Iranian drone facilities. That's really nonsense, but he did actually claim that a little over a year ago. So there's still way too much potential for this to spin off into places that no one expected. In ways not completely unlike, at least, how World War I began, right? But we shouldn't have any illusion that we're sleepwalking into this. No one is sleepwalking, right? Everyone is fully conscious and awake and walking forward into this, knowing what they're doing. And, we're living through it. It is a watershed in geopolitical, in world history that we will almost certainly, assuming that we have grandchildren, tell our grandchildren about.
Even even a liberal thinker like Mr. John Eikenberry has mentioned that in liberal internationalism 3.0,
Yes.
that the US will have to consider voices from the global south, and countries like China and Russia will have to be taken on board if we really have to see a peaceful existence. So my one last question would be about the upcoming US election. Mr. Putin recently made some very interesting comments that he would rather prefer Kamala Harris over Trump. So I want to ask, did he really mean that, or was he just playing with the US audience? And also, how would US's Russia policy look like under Trump or Kamala, because Trump really has some very interesting people in his inner circle. You mentioned Mr. J.D. Vance, there's Mr. Elbridge Colby, and Mike Pompeo. Whereas on Kamala Harris is likely to continue Mr. Biden's policy as well. So, what is your take on all of this?
Elbridge Colby is a perfect example of the China hawk that would rather be desperate to fight a war with China, and once he feels that resources for that are being wasted on a war with Russia. He's a perfect example of that. So first of all, as it's almost certain that Kamala Harris, if she wins, right, has no foreign policy experience or knowledge whatsoever. Right? I mean, I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. So she will farm out her foreign policy to people that are chosen out of the Democratic Party's portion of the blob of the DC establishment, right? Some other version of Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan will be running the country. It won't be Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, like who's running the country right now and probably has been for the last 2 years, really. But it will be someone like that. And almost certainly that will mean a continuation of the same policies. And I think it's pretty safe to say that early on in a Kamala Harris presidency, that she will feel the need as a woman, as the first U.S. president, to prove that she is tough, right? To prove that she is capable of being a tough leader. And at the same time, other countries around the world will want to test her. That's why I'm not confident that not only will there be any improvement of these potential conflicts, but they will almost certainly get worse. If Donald Trump wins, no one knows what he's going to do. And like I said, Donald Trump doesn't know what he's going to do. Depends on who Donald Trump talked to 15 minutes ago and flattered him and convinced him of something. He's not a man who has foreign policy principles, right? Who adheres to some type of international relations theory, right?
More transactionalist.
Yes. Well, not just transactionalism. I have to say that I believe there is a degree of venality and ignorance that underrides everything as well. But you're right. He does see everything as a transactional relationship, which is not at all the way that the DC establishment, that the blob conceives of foreign policy and relations, which is why there's so much bluff there. So Kamala Harris will mean more of the same, perhaps more. Trump, we don't know. As to what Putin was doing, look, the Russian government is on record many times before saying that they don't actually believe it really matters who is sitting in the Oval Office. That U.S. foreign policy is not dictated by the president, that it's directed by what Ben Rhodes called the blob, call it the deep state, call it the permanent bureaucracy. But in the end of the day, a U.S. president only has so many people he can appoint and a limited pool of people that he can appoint from, right? That have experience, that are capable, and that keeps a charted course, right? Of a foreign policy establishment in pursuit of hegemony. It's just not something that I believe is easy to change. And that's the way the Russian government sees it. And at some level, they simply believe it doesn't matter, that U.S. policy will continue, whether it's Obama, whether it's Trump, whether it's Biden, whether it's Kamala Harris or Trump again, or whoever. But that being said, obviously, Donald Trump is someone who exists outside of the DC establishment way of thinking. And Putin has said before that he would prefer a Biden presidency because Joe Biden is a Cold War era dinosaur and is eminently predictable, right? They have psychological models of Joe Biden, right? Joe Biden's been in heavy in U.S. foreign policy in the Senate for decades. They know who he is. He's a known quantity. They know what he's going to do. They know what he's going to say. They have entire psychological profiles of him. And when you're dealing with the two most heavily nuclear armed countries on earth and their relations with each other, ultimately you're descending into game theory. And a predictable opponent on the other side is eminently more stable and reassuring than an unpredictable opponent. So when they say they prefer Biden over Trump because Biden is predictable, that's not just playing U.S. politics. I believe that is honest. And when he says the same about Kamala Harris, I think to some extent that is a continuation. They know that Kamala Harris's foreign policy will be dictated by people other than her, people who are part of that establishment, and Russia knows what they will do in any given situation because, it's already, they've already been a part of that establishment, right? There's papers written on it. Rand has a gaming strategy for a war with Russia for decades and into the future, right? Extending Russia, right? They know what they're going to do. Trump, they just don't know what he's going to do. That's the problem with Trump. I like to think of Trump as a chaos bomb, right? If the Trump chaos bomb goes off in DC and evolves into a war between Trump and the institutions of the other institutions of the U.S. government, great, right? That means destabilization internally of the U.S. But you don't know that that's where the chaos bomb is going to go off. Maybe the chaos bomb will go off in some area of foreign policy instead. And Trump will start a war against Iran or China, or will, turn on Putin because he said something nice about Kamala Harris. Russia doesn't know where that chaos bomb is going to go off. So while you could say, oh, Trump will decrease relations with other European NATO members and he'll cause domestic divisions at home, yes, maybe. But the potential for an unpredictable president is, in charge of what is still, in many ways, the most powerful, wealthiest country in the world. It's too much to risk. So whatever claims that Russia is meddling in the election, that's all just domestic propaganda in the United States. That is, I believe, the FBI trying to influence U.S. elections. And Russia will just be hands off and, hope for whoever is elected the best and knowing they'll have to deal with them regardless. But ultimately feeling that predictable is probably the safer bet than unpredictable.
Well, sir, that was a masterclass conversation in itself. I like how you analyze the reality on the ground and how the conversation was dehyphenated, like from the hyphenated and hyped up conversations in the Western media. So I thank you for your time and I look forward to hosting you again, sir.
And let me just say that I congratulate you for your studies at SOAS. I did my postgraduate studies at LSE. So I was back in 2010. I was in the same section of London and a lot of the same things, enjoying a lot of Model UN and crisis scenarios with students from from SOAS. So I have a lot of fun. As much as one can have fond memories of London, I have fond memories of the postgraduate studies in the College of London, the Greater College of London. So, all I can say is great, and carry through with whatever you're doing, and go back and lead India or whatever else you want to get involved in anywhere. I think it's great.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.